The sea had always been a whisper to Brother Finian, a distant rumor that the older monks spoke of in hushed tones. They said it was vast and hungry, a beast that swallowed ships and men without remorse. They said it was the border between civilization and the savage lands of the north, where demons in human form worshipped false gods and drank blood from the skulls of their enemies. Finian had never seen the sea. He had never needed to. His world was the stone walls of St. Cuthbert's Priory, the herb garden he tended with careful hands, the scriptorium where he copied holy texts by candlelight, and the chapel where he prayed 7 times a day. He had been left at the priory gates as an infant, wrapped in a woolen blanket, his only possession a small wooden cross and a shock of red hair so vivid that the monks had crossed themselves and whispered about the devil's mark. They had taken him in anyway, because that was what the Lord commanded. But they had never quite stopped looking at him as if he carried something dangerous beneath his skin. Finian was 18 winters old when the whisper became a roar. It happened at dawn, when the autumn mist rolled in from the east so thick that the world beyond the priory walls disappeared into a wall of grey. He was in the herb garden, cutting sage for the infirmary, his fingers stained green with the sap of crushed leaves. The bell for prime had not yet rung, and the only sounds were the distant cry of gulls and the soft rustle of wind through the reeds that grew along the cliffs. Then the screaming began. At first, Finian thought it was the wind, but the wind did not scream in words. The wind did not shout in a language he had never heard but somehow understood. The wind did not carry the clang of metal and the wet thud of axes finding flesh. He dropped his basket and ran toward the priory, his bare feet slipping on the dew-slick grass, his heart pounding a rhythm he did not recognize. The gates had been shattered. The great wooden doors that had stood for 200 years lay in splinters on the ground. And through the gap, Finian saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Men poured into the courtyard like a flood of iron and fur. They were taller than any men he had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed too broad for their frames and arms that swung axes as if they weighed nothing. Their hair was long and wild, some pale as straw, some dark as the sea at midnight, and their faces were painted with symbols that seemed to shift in the torchlight. They were not demons, they were worse. They were men who had decided long ago that mercy was a weakness, and that the only law was the law of the strong. Finian stood frozen in the doorway of the herb garden, watching his world collapse. Brother Oldhelm, the librarian, fell beneath a blade before he could even raise his hands in prayer. Brother Oswin, who had taught Finian to read, was dragged across the stones by his grey beard, his screams cut short by a boot to his throat. The chapel doors were kicked open, and the silver chalice that had held the Eucharist for generations was torn from the altar and stuffed into a leather sack. Finian should have run. He should have fled into the marsh, hidden in the reeds, prayed for the nightmare to end. But his legs would not move. They had turned to stone, rooted to the earth, and all he could do was stand there, his red hair like a beacon in the grey morning light, waiting for the blade that would send him to meet the God he had served his entire life. The Viking came out of nowhere. One moment, Finian was alone. The next, a shadow fell over him so vast that it blotted out the sun. He looked up and up and up and found himself staring into the face of a man who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. The Viking was taller than any man Finian had ever seen, with shoulders that strained the leather of his tunic and arms covered in tattoos that coiled like serpents around his biceps. His hair was the color of wheat in summer, long and braided with silver rings, and his beard was thick and streaked with the blood of men Finian had known his whole life. But it was his eyes that held Finian frozen. They were the color of the sea before a storm, pale gray blue, and they were looking at him with an expression that was not rage, not hunger, not the cold satisfaction of a killer. It was something else, something that looked almost like wonder. The Viking raised his axe. Finian closed his eyes and waited for the end. The blow never came. He heard a grunt, a shuffle of boots on stone, and when he opened his eyes, the Viking had lowered his weapon. The man was staring at Finian's hair, his scarred face slack with something that might have been disbelief. Slowly, as if reaching for something sacred, The Viking extended a hand and touched a strand of Finian's red hair. His fingers were rough, calloused, stained with blood, but they moved with a gentleness that made Finian's breath catch. The Viking traced the lock of hair from Finian's temple to his shoulder, his eyes following the movement as if watching a flame dance. Another Viking appeared, younger and leaner, his face split by a grin that showed too many teeth. "Kill him, Stigga. He is just a priest. Kill him and let us go." The giant Stigga did not look away from Finian's hair. He shook his head, a single definitive motion, and the younger Viking's grin faltered. "Stigga, what are you doing?" "He is nothing. He is." Stigga turned his head slowly, and the look he gave the younger man was colder than the winter sea. The younger Viking swallowed, stepped back, and disappeared into the chaos of the courtyard. Stigga turned back to Finian, and for a long moment they stood there, the monk and the killer, separated by everything but connected by something neither of them understood. Then Stigga reached down, picked up the basket of sage that Finian had dropped, and pressed it into the monk's trembling hands. He gestured toward the gate, a jerk of his head that meant go, run, flee. But when Finian tried to move, his legs buckled and he would have fallen if Stigga had not caught him by the arm. The Viking sighed, a sound of exasperation that seemed almost human. Then he looped a rope around Finian's wrists, loosely, so loosely that Finian could have slipped free if he had tried, and led him through the burning courtyard toward the beach. The other prisoners were shoved and beaten, forced to march with their hands bound so tight that blood dripped from their fingers. Finian walked beside Stigga, his rope trailing like a leash that was never pulled, and when he stumbled on the rocky path down to the shore, Stigga caught him again. The Viking did not speak. He could not speak, Finian would later learn, because a sword had cut across his throat years ago, leaving him with a voice that was barely a whisper and a pain that never fully healed. But he did not need words. His action spoke louder than any battle cry. The longship was called the Sea Serpent, and it was the largest vessel Finian had ever seen. Its prow was carved into the shape of a dragon with gaping jaws, and its hull was black with tar and the salt of 1,000 voyages. The prisoners were herded into the hold like cattle, packed so tightly that they could not sit or lie down. But Stigga led Finian past them, past the stares and the whispers, to a small space near the mast where a pile of furs had been laid out. He untied the rope from Finian's wrists and gestured for him to sit. Then he produced a water skin and a piece of dried fish, which he placed on the deck within Finian's reach. Finian stared at the food, then at the Viking. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Stigga touched his own hair, then pointed at Finian's. He made a gesture that Finian did not understand, a hand over his heart, then a hand toward the horizon, and then he turned and walked away, leaving Finian alone with his confusion and his fear. The journey north took 10 days. 10 days of cold spray and salt-crusted skin, of sleeping on furs that smelled of their previous owners, of watching the coastline of his homeland shrink until it disappeared entirely. Stigga brought him food and water each day, and at night, when the crew slept, the Viking would sit beside him and trace pictures in the condensation on the deck. A woman with long hair, a child playing in the snow, a house with smoke rising from its chimney. Finian began to understand that Stigga was telling him a story, the story of a mother with red hair, a mother who had been taken from her homeland and sold into slavery, a mother who had died when Stigga was young, leaving him with nothing but the memory of the color of her hair. "You see her in me," Finian said one night, his voice barely audible above the creak of the hull. "That is why you did not kill me, because my hair reminds you of her." Stigga looked at him for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes unreadable. Then he nodded. Finian felt something crack open in his chest. He had never had a mother. He had never been loved by anyone who was not bound by duty or the fear of God. But this man, this killer, this raider, this stranger from a land he had been taught to hate, looked at him as if he were precious, as if he were the answer to a prayer that had gone unanswered for decades. The fjord of the fallen star was everything Finian had imagined and nothing he had expected. The settlement was carved into the base of a cliff, its longhouses built from massive logs that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. The air was cold and clean, sharp with the scent of pine and salt, and the sky was a shade of blue that Finian had never seen in the south, pale and endless, like the inside of a frozen sea. The people who lived there were not the demons of the stories. They were farmers and fishermen, mothers and children, old men who carved runes into bone, and young women who laughed as they hung fish to dry on wooden racks. They stared at Finian as he walked through the settlement, his red hair like a flame against the grey stone, and he heard the whispers. "Stigger's thrall," they said. "The red-haired one. Look at him. Look at his eyes." Jarl Harold Frostbeard sat on a throne of whalebone in the great hall, his silver hair braided with iron rings, his pale eyes cold as the winter sky. He looked at Finian, then at Stigger, and his expression did not change. "You brought a priest," Harold said. It was not a question. Stigger nodded. "He is not a warrior. He is not a craftsman. He cannot farm. He cannot fish. He cannot fight. What use is he to us?" Stigger touched his own hair, then pointed at Finian's. He made the same gesture he had made on the ship. A hand over his heart, then a hand toward the horizon, and Harold's expression shifted. Something flickered in those cold eyes, something that might have been memory or grief or both. "Your mother," Harold said quietly. "She had hair like that." Stigger nodded again. Harold leaned back in his throne, studying Finian with new eyes. "Very well. He is yours. He eats what you eat, sleeps where you sleep, and if he causes trouble, you answer for it. Do you understand?" Stigger placed a hand on his chest, over his heart, and bowed his head. Finian did not understand what had just happened, but he understood that his life had been spared a second time, and that he now belonged to the silent giant who looked at him as if he were a ghost of someone long lost. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Finian's life. Stigger did not treat him as a thrall. He did not make him scrub floors or carry water or perform the menial tasks that the other prisoners were forced to do. Instead, he took Finian to a small hut at the edge of the settlement, pushed him inside, and pointed to a bed of furs in the corner. Then he pointed to a wooden chest, to a wash basin, to a shelf of clay pots that held herbs and salves. He was giving Finian a home. A small one, a humble one, but a home nonetheless. Finian did not know what to do with this kindness. He had spent his whole life believing that the Vikings were monsters, that they were incapable of mercy or love or anything beyond bloodlust. But Stigger was none of those things. He was quiet and patient, and when Finian made mistakes, when he burned the porridge, when he dropped the axe he was supposed to be learning to swing, when he cried in the night because he missed the sound of the chapel bells, Stigger did not punish him. He simply sat beside him, his massive presence a comfort rather than a threat, and waited for the storm to pass. "You are too soft," Sigrun said to Finian one day as she watched him struggle to split firewood. She was the old healer who lived in the hut on the cliff, a woman with white hair and eyes that had seen too much. She had taken an interest in Finian, perhaps because she saw in him the same fragility she had seen in her own children before they died. "Stigger is trying to harden you, but you are like water. You flow around the rocks instead of breaking them." "I do not want to be hard," Finian said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I want to go home." Sigrun's expression softened. "This is your home now, boy. The sooner you accept that, the easier it will be." But Finian did not accept it. He dreamed of the priory, of the herb garden, of the scriptorium, where he had spent his days painting the margins of holy texts with vines and flowers. He dreamed of Brother Oswin, who had taught him to read, and of Father Oldwin, who had raised him with a kindness that was always tinged with suspicion. He dreamed of the chapel, of the candles flickering before the altar, of the peace that had filled him when he knelt and closed his eyes. And every morning, he woke to the cold grey light of the north, to the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, to the knowledge that he would never see any of it again. One night, a storm rolled in from the sea, so fierce that the waves rose higher than the longhouses, and the wind tore the roofs from the drying racks. Stigger had gone with the other warriors to secure the ships, and Finian was alone in the hut, huddled under the firs, praying to a god he was no longer sure was listening. He heard a crash, a scream, and then nothing. He waited, his heart pounding, and when the door burst open, he saw Stigger silhouetted against the lightning, his shoulder pierced by an arrow, his tunic soaked with blood. Finian's training as an infirmarian took over. He had no fear, no hesitation, only the knowledge of what needed to be done. He pushed Stiger onto the bed of furs, tore open his tunic, and examined the wound. The arrow had sunk deep, missing the bone but tearing through muscle. If it was not removed, the wound would fester, and Stiger would die. "I need hot water," Finian said, his voice steady despite the terror that clawed at his throat. "I need clean cloth. I need honey, if you have it, and yarrow, and—" Stiger pointed to a chest in the corner. Finian threw it open and found everything he needed. Bandages, salves, a small pot of honey that had been harvested from the wild bees that nested in the cliffs. He worked through the night, his hands steady, his movements sure, and when he finally pulled the arrow from Stiger's shoulder, the Viking did not cry out. He simply closed his eyes and let Finian work. The wound took 3 days to close. Finian stayed by Stiger's side the entire time, changing the bandages, applying the honey and yarrow, forcing water between the Viking's cracked lips when the fever made him delirious. On the second night, Stiger's hand found Finian's in the darkness, and he held on with a grip that should have crushed bone, but somehow did not. Finian did not pull away. He sat there, holding the hand of the man who had killed his brothers and burned his home, and felt something shift inside him, something that was not hatred, something that was not forgiveness, something that was entirely new. On the third day, Stiger opened his eyes. They were clearer now, the fever broken, and they found Finian asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head resting on his arms, his red hair spilling across the furs like a promise. Stiger reached out and touched it, just once, his fingers tracing the strands with the same gentleness he had shown on the day they met. Then he closed his eyes and slept, and when he woke again, Finian was still there. After that, everything changed. The other Vikings stopped looking at Finian as a thrall and started looking at him as something else, a healer perhaps, or a curiosity, or simply the man who had saved Stiger's life when no one else could. Finian began to find his place in the settlement. He tended the sick and the wounded, using the knowledge he had gained in the priory's infirmary. He taught the children to read, using a stick to trace letters in the dirt. He learned to fish, to cook, to mend nets, to survive in a world that had no room for softness, and he learned to read Stiger. The Viking's silence was not empty, it was full of meanings that Finian slowly learned to decode. The tilt of his head, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes softened when Finian laughed at something the children said. Stiger did not need words. He had other ways of speaking, and Finian was learning to listen. One evening, as they sat on the cliffs above the fjord, watching the sun set the sea on fire, Stiger took a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote on a flat stone, "Your name. What does it mean?" Finian smiled. "Finian, it means fair or white. But my hair is neither, so perhaps my mother had a sense of humor." Stiger wrote again, "Your mother, do you remember her?" Finian shook his head. "I was left at the priory as a baby. The monks said she was probably a sinner who could not keep me. They said my hair was the mark of the devil, proof that I was born of sin." Stiger's jaw tightened. He wrote, "My mother had hair like yours. She was not a sinner, she was a queen, taken from her homeland, sold to my father. She died when I was 7 winters old. I held her hand. She said, 'Find the red hair. It will lead you home.'" Finian stared at the words, his heart pounding. "You think I am, what? A sign? A message from the dead?" Stiger looked at him, and in his gray-blue eyes Finian saw something he had never seen before. Not the coldness of a killer, not the grief of a son, but something softer, something that looked like hope. He wrote, "I do not know what you are, but you are not nothing. You have never been nothing." The winter passed, slow and dark, and Finian stopped counting the days since he had left the priory. The settlement became his home in ways he had not expected. He knew the names of the children now, knew which women were widows and which men had lost brothers, knew the stories that were carved into the runestones that stood at the edge of the fjord. He knew that Stiger had fought in 12 battles, that he had been wounded 9 times, that he had never taken a wife because he had never found anyone who made him feel less alone. And he knew with a certainty that terrified him that he did not want to leave. Spring came slowly, the ice cracking and groaning as it melted, the first green shoots pushing up through the frozen ground. A trading ship arrived from the south, carrying news and goods and a letter that changed everything. The letter was from Father Oldwin, the prior of St. Cuthbert's. It said that the priory had been rebuilt, that the surviving monks had returned, and that Finian was welcome to come home if he wished. The letter was short and formal, written in the careful script that Finian had learned as a child, and it ended with a blessing and an invitation. Finian read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Then he folded it and tucked it into his tunic and went to find Stiga. The Viking was standing on the cliffs, his back to the settlement, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon. He had heard about the letter. Everyone had heard. The news had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and the whispers followed Finian wherever he went. He will leave. Of course he will leave. He was never one of us. Finian stood beside Stiga, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his massive body. The wind whipped their hair, Stiga's pale gold and Finian's vivid red, and the sea crashed against the rocks far below. I could go back, Finian said. They want me back. They say I am forgiven for whatever sin made them look at me with suspicion for 18 years. Stiga did not move. He did not look at Finian, but his hand hanging at his side curled into a fist. But I do not know if I want to be forgiven, Finian continued. I do not know if I want to go back to a place where I was always the outsider, the red-haired boy with the devil's mark. I do not know if I want to spend the rest of my life praying for a salvation I'm no longer sure I need. Stiga turned his head, his gray-blue eyes meeting Finian's. There was a question in them, a question he could not ask with words, a question that hung in the air between them like the mist that clung to the fjord in the morning. Finian reached into his tunic and pulled out the letter. He looked at it for a long moment, at the familiar script, at the signature of the man who had raised him. Then he tore it in half, and in half again, and he let the pieces fall into the sea where they swirled for a moment on the wind before disappearing into the waves. I am staying, he said, if you will have me. Stiga's hand uncurled. He reached out and touched Finian's hair, the same gesture he had made on the day they met, but this time his fingers lingered. This time they traced the strands as if memorizing them, as if committing the color to a memory that would never fade. Then Stiga did something Finian had never seen him do. He opened his mouth and he spoke. The sound was rough, broken, each word dragged from a throat that had been silent for years. But the words were clear. Stay, Stiga said, please. It was the first time Finian had heard his voice, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever known. Finian did not become a Viking. He did not learn to swing an axe or sail a longship or kill without remorse. But he became something else. He became the healer of the settlement, the one the warriors came to when they were wounded, the one the mothers came to when their children were sick, the one the old men came to when they wanted to hear stories of a world beyond the cold and the sea. He taught the children to read and write, not in Latin, but in the runes of the north. And he wrote down the stories that had been passed down for generations, preserving them for the future. And he stayed with Stiga. He stayed through the spring and the summer, through the harvest and the next winter, through the raids that took Stiga away for weeks at a time, and the long nights when Finian waited by the fire, listening for the sound of his footsteps on the path. He stayed through the arguments and the silences, through the moments of joy and the moments of grief, through the slow, steady process of learning what it meant to be loved by someone who had spent his whole life alone. One night, a year after Finian had torn up the letter, they sat on the cliffs again, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The colors were like nothing Finian had ever seen, green and purple and gold, shifting and swirling as if the heavens themselves were alive. Stiga sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Finian leaned into the warmth of him. I used to think that God was in the chapel, Finian said quietly, in the candles, in the incense, in the sound of the monks chanting. But I think I was wrong. I think God is here, in the cold, in the sea, in the way the light moves across the sky, in the way you look at me, as if I am something more than the sum of my fears. Stiga turned to him, and in the light of the aurora, His eyes were the color of the sea itself. He reached out and took Finian's hand, his rough fingers intertwining with Finian's slender ones, and he did not let go. "You are not nothing," Stiga said, his voice still rough, still broken, but stronger now. "You have never been nothing. You are my home." Finian felt tears slide down his cheeks, warm against the cold wind, and he did not wipe them away. He had spent his whole life searching for a place where he belonged, a place where his red hair was not a curse, a place where he was seen and not just tolerated. He had thought he would find it in the priory. He had thought he would find it in prayer. But he had found it here, in the cold, in the north, in the arms of a man who had killed his brothers and burned his home, and then looked at him as if he were the answer to a prayer he had stopped praying years ago. "I am home," Finian said. "I have always been home. I just did not know it yet." They sat on the cliffs until the aurora faded and the stars came out, and the sea whispered its ancient songs below. And Finian, the boy from the monastery who had caught a warrior's eye, finally understood that the greatest adventure was not sailing across the sea or fighting in battles or winning glory for the gods. It was finding a place where you belonged. It was finding a person who looked at you and saw not your sins or your scars or your failures, but your soul. It was choosing to stay, even when staying was harder than running. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know if the raids would continue, if the winters would grow colder, if the old gods of the north would ever accept a monk who still whispered prayers to a crucified carpenter. But he knew one thing, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones and warmed him more than any fire ever could. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And he would never be alone again. The northern lights danced across the sky, and Finian closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life he did not pray. He simply sat in the silence, holding the hand of the man who had saved him, and let himself be happy.